office hours on Wednesdays. So if you're planning to present a poster or a talk at PAA and you want feedback on your visualizations, you can sign up for a slot there. Anything else? I think that's it. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Bill Lavely.
Well, it's with great pride that I introduce Busarawan Tirwichachanan, who is also known as Book. And she is a, let's see, I have an order to do this. She's Associate Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology at National University of Singapore, and she's also co-director of the Center for Family and Population Research. She has written extensively about childlessness, about population health and welfare, aging and intergenerational relations, and the demography of war. She received her BA in English at Chulalongkorn University. Then she came to Seattle, where she did an MA and PhD in sociology right here and also in CSDE. She's received numerous awards and fellowships. She was a Fulbright Fellow, among other things. And let's see. She is, I won't go through all of those awards.
Oh, that's okay.
She's currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. So please join me in welcoming Book.
Okay, can everyone in the back hear me? Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much, Bill, for the kind introduction. And thank you, Sarah, Robin, and Maddie, who's not here, for inviting. Oh, Maddie, okay, great. Yeah, and for the invitation and for making this trip possible. As Bill mentioned, I was really glad to be here and actually feel really honored because, you know, CSDE, I mean, I benefited a great deal from this community. And of course, CSDE is, you know, very central to my graduate's experience. Long time ago, it's actually 2 decades ago. Can't believe that. And attending the weekly seminar is sort of the highlight from that experience. And I think towards the last few years of my as a graduate student here, I think the CSD seminar moved here in Parrington. But Parrington Hall looks very different then. It's, you know, we don't have something like this, but it's still very charming. So I'm really feel honored to be here, so thank you. So as Bill has mentioned, I've spent the last 7 months on sabbatical at Stanford. And so this period has given me opportunity to step back and take stock of what I have learned from my research project on childless aging in Singapore and Thailand. So today I'm going to talk about that piece of work and particularly what it means for a social relationship, inequality, as well as for policy when more and more people age without children or with limited kin. I will frame my presentation around a few puzzles that emerged from my data, but these puzzles, you know, I think have broader implications beyond Southeast Asia. So I'm looking forward to your feedback. Okay, so before I start, let me give you with a roadmap of today's talk. So I will start by situating the demographic shift that we are observing. Rapid population aging alongside shrinking kin networks in society that remain strongly family-oriented. And I will then draw from findings from my childless aging in Singapore and Thailand or CAST to illustrate how this shift playing out empirically. And I would highlight the 4 insights about aging with limited kin And I will end by reflecting what this means for institution and for the future of equitable aging. Okay. All right, so I'm going to start by situating the studies within a broader demographic moment. So across Asia, population aging is unfolding at the speed and scale that is historically unprecedented. So you can see from this figure, many countries in the region are moving from 7 to 14% of their population being aged 65 and older. So this is the standard thresholds that demographers use to define society at the point that they become an aged society. So in just a few decades, these countries like Singapore, it takes about 25 years. In Thailand, even shorter, about 20 years. By contrast, countries like France took more than a century. In United States, it takes about 69 years, right? So for many Asian countries, this is not simply population aging, but it is compressed aging. So the second figures places this demographic shift in a global perspective. So here you see that the projected growth of population aged 65 and above across different world regions from 2020 up to about 2060, right? So the key point here is quite straightforward. So Asia will account for the majority of the world's older adults for the foreseeable future. The steep rise in the green region shows that between now and 2060, Asia will contribute the largest absolute increase in older adults globally. So this means what we observe in Asia will shape the contours of global aging. And aging is only one part of the story. So let me show you another. If we zoom into family formation trends, we see another profound shift underway. So across successive cohorts of women in various Asian countries, permanent childlessness has risen sharply. So for women born in early 1950s, permanent childlessness hover around 15% in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. But for women born around 1980, so these levels approach 30%. So this means that nearly 1 in 3 women in these societies are likely to enter later life without children. So the second figures places these Asian countries in international perspective. So among women born in 1972, who's now in their early 50s and most likely past their childbearing years, you can see that countries like Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore had some of the highest permanent childlessness rates in the world, exceeding many European countries as well as Canada. So Asia is not only aging rapidly, but it is aging with more adults entering old age without children. So when childlessness rises across cohorts, the implication extend beyond the absence of children. So it means fewer siblings, fewer in-laws, fewer nieces and nephews. So a thinning of extended kinship network more broadly. So a recent demographic projection by a colleague at Max Planck showed that the supply of kin is shrinking globally. So to give one concrete illustration, an older Chinese woman turning 65 around year 2000 could expect to have roughly about 60 living relatives. So fast forward to 2050, that number is projected to fall to around 30, so 100% reduction. So within just a few generations, the architecture of family life, which includes relationships that people can draw upon for their support, has fundamentally transformed. So today, to make this more concrete, let me give you some personal story to illustrate how these demographic shifts have unfolded within 3 generations in my own family. By the way, I'm Thai, but I'm based in Singapore, but this year I'm at Stanford. So my grandparents immigrated from southern China to Thailand after the Second World War, and they had 11 children. So my mom grew up with 10 siblings. So by next generations, family size had already contracted. So here I am with my 3 siblings. Each of my mom's siblings had between 1 and 4 children, and 2 of them are actually childless. But even so, I remember growing up with a lot of cousins and extended family. So in my generation, the shift is even more pronounced. Among the 4 of us, only my sister had a child. So this is me, but with my nephew. So unlike my childhood, which was filled with cousins and extended family, my nephew has no first cousin on his maternal side. So within just a few decades, what was once a dense and thin network has become much thinner. So this trajectory is not unique to my family. It reflects a broader demographic transformation across many parts of Asia and perhaps beyond. So I gave a earlier version of this talk at Caspers, where I'm affiliated this year. So 2 fellows, both Americans, came up to me after my talk and mentioned that my family story looked very much like theirs. Just maybe 1 generation apart, but moving towards the same direction. So to better understand this phenomenon, I led a study called Childless Aging in Singapore and Thailand, or CAST. So it's a mixed method study of adults aged 50 and older in Singapore and Thailand. So these are the 2 of Southeast Asia most aged societies. So the distinctive feature of the study is that we oversample individuals without children, without living children. So it means like, so childlessness in our study refers to people who never had children in their life, whether by choice or by postponement or due to infertility. We also include a small numbers of people who experience the loss of their children. So in Singapore, we conducted original nationally representative survey of about 1,500 individuals, and we follow up with about 30 of them for more in-depth discussions. So in Thailand, because of budget constraint as well as because of pandemic, we analyzed existing nationally representative survey of older adults, and we complemented by using the same interview guidelines and interview 30 people in Thailand. So one long-standing challenge in Asian family demography is that childless older adults are relatively rare in most aging surveys. So as a result, in studies that has been published so far, they often treated childless as a single homogeneous group, right? So we don't understand a different pathway that they become childlessness. So by oversampling childless individuals and integrating these qualitative interviews, we are able to look at heterogeneity within childlessness. We can understand better how people arrive at middle age or old age without children. We can better understand how they construct their support networks and how they plan for their later life. So in case you don't know Singapore and Thailand, allow me to spend a bit of time to contextualize these 2 countries. As I mentioned earlier, these are the 2 most aged population in Southeast Asia. Singapore TFR fell to about 0.87 last year, which is considered one of the world lowest. So given the sustained low fertility combined with life expectancy of about 84, which is one of the highest in the world, Singapore is projected to be among the world's oldest societies by mid-century. So on the other hand, Thailand's fertility has fallen to around 1 child per woman and continues to decline. By the way, Thailand's TFR now is lower than Japan. Right? So population aging is accelerating and population decline is already underway. So despite the differences in economic and human development in these 2 contexts, both settings share one similar institutional feature, which is aging and care remain fundamentally family-centered. So adult children remain the primary and expected source of OH support. And so why does shrinking kin matter so much in these 2 contexts? So I argue that because aging in Southeast Asia and much of Asia has historically been organized around familism, not only culturally, but also institutionally. Singapore, for example, is often described as a classic case of state familism. Policy actively reinforce family-based support. For instance, public housing grants incentivize that individuals or adults living with or near their parents. And as you know, Singapore has one of the most expensive places to live, to buy properties in the world. So this kind of policy incentivize co-residence. So caregiving subsidies also routed through family ties. Retirement arrangement allow older adults to draw on their children's resources. Cultural norms, like other Asian contexts, further reinforce this arrangement. Filial piety, for example, remains strong, a strong guiding principle. And adult children are expected to support their parents, and turning to the state is often seen as the last resort. And there's also legal structure that codify these expectations. You might have heard of law in Singapore and as well as in some other Asian countries that legally obligates adult children to provide for their parents. So if they don't provide, parents have the right to sue their children. So similar logics operates across much of East and Southeast Asia, though maybe they might be expressed differently. So the family-based models of aging rest on a demographic assumption that dense and multi-generational kin networks are present and available. But as childlessness rises, fertility declines and population age rapidly, that assumption becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. So this leads to my two core questions of this project. So first, how do people age in systems that build around family when their family networks are thinning? And secondly, how might these changes reconfigure inequality in later life? And so to address these questions, I would draw on empirical evidence from my childless aging project. So I'm going to share with you a few insights that I get from that from this set of data. Some of the papers has already been published. Some are under review. If you have any interest in any of them, you could email me. So the first insight from CAS is that limited kin is structurally multidimensional. So we often speak of childless as if they form a single homogeneous category. And this tendency tend to miss important variation within the growing demographic of childless older persons. So in a study that we published a couple of years ago, we look at pathway to childlessness among childless Singaporeans, and we use latent class analysis. So we find that permanent childlessness emerges through multiple and distinct life course pathway that are shaped by education, occupational trajectories, marital timing, and partnership stability. So we find that these pathways are becoming more diverse across successive birth cohorts, as reflected in the in the graph on your left-hand side or right-hand side. Okay, so in other words, what it means is that younger cohorts in our sample arrive at permanent childlessness through a wider range of pathway. Not just because of late marital timing or certain career trajectories or infertility, but through increasingly life course profile. Another evidence in support of second demographic transition theory is that we observe a growing decoupling between marriage and fertility across birth cohorts. So this means that the rising share of married individuals in Singapore who remain voluntarily childless, it's increasingly becoming more common. So this matters because the family-based model of aging and care assume that marriage leads to children and therefore available kin support, but that assumption is becoming increasingly less reliable. So not only that pathway to permanent childlessness becoming increasingly diverse, But I also noted that limited kin also take multiple forms beyond childlessness. So when I started the project, I focused primarily on actual childlessness, meaning that people who have no children by the time they reach midlife or later life as the key form of kin limitation. But over the course of my research, I came to see that this focus may be too narrow and that the scope needed to be broadened. So first, much of Asia, where marriage has long been the gateway of childbearing, a substantial share of childless, middle-aged, and older adults, particularly women, have never married. So they're both unpartnered and childless, so often referred to as kinless by demographers and gerontologists, right? So moreover, it is important to distinguish between actual childlessness and what we might call functional or de facto childlessness. So these are individuals who have children, but those children are geographically distant or otherwise unavailable for support. And if you look at the graph on the slides, you could see that, so this is based on a survey of older persons in Thailand, repeated cross-sectional surveys. So I find that de facto childless, which is shown in the orange line, is substantially more common than actual childlessness and has been rising steadily over time, right? So actual childlessness, people who did not have any living children, account for, increased modestly from about 5% in 2007 to about 9% in 2021. But de facto childlessness is much higher, right? In the most recent wave of survey in 2021, de facto childlessness account for nearly, for a little bit over a quarter of older adults, right? So, so here de facto childlessness defined as people who have children, but that children are not living in the same household or nearby, right? And so the implication is that if we focus only on actual childlessness as the primary form of kin limitation, we risk overlooking a large and growing segment of older adults who may face constraints in assessing kin-based support. So let me show you the evidence here. So this is analysis, again, using a survey of older persons in Thailand and in 2021. And we look at how kin configurations, including de facto childlessness and actual childlessness and presence of spouse is related to the likelihood of receiving care when they have long-term care needs. And what we find is that it's actually not actual childlessness, right? But de facto childlessness who are more at risk of not receiving long-term care, right? And this happens even with the presence of the spouse. People following me? Okay, great. So this is precisely why I argue for conceptualizing limited kin as multidimensional, right? Not just a simple binary of not having or not having a child. So this leads to my second insight, which we find that limited kin is associated with both vulnerabilities and resilience in later life. And that across Asia, childless aging is often framed as a looming crisis. So in Asia, the media headlines like the one on your right say that, you know, call this group as elderly orphans, that they are isolated and they are at risk of dying alone, right? So in China, a recent viral AI-generated video depicts a middle-aged woman expressing regrets over not having any children. So the clips were was circulated by parents to urge their adult children to marry and have children. So this is the response for very low fertility, right? So these examples are common in media narrative across Asia, reinforces the idea that childlessness leads to abandonment and a lack of support in later life. And so it reflects the dominant deficit narrative that we see as very prevalent. But evidence from my project suggests a more complex picture.
But how do you classify people who have treatment loss
Hmm.
in the lifetime?
Okay, so in my study, if they lost them and it's a cross-sectional survey. So we classify them as actual childless because they don't have children at the time that we survey them. But literature often say that this group tends to be more vulnerable than all kinds of childlessness, right? But usually they're quite small in our sample. Okay, so now I turn to data from Singapore. But before I continue, how much time do I have? Okay. Okay, no, I still have a lot more. So I turn to my data from Singapore. So in these studies, so we use latent class analysis to look at network profile of people who are childless, right? And so we look at and we characterize this profile by looking at the different types of support exchanges between parents, childless individuals and parents with their siblings, extended network, as well as with their kin, with their non-kin, their friends and neighbors, right? We also take into account their community participation and their religious participation. So what we found, so the analysis show the 5 profile of network profile among childless Singaporeans. So we find that far from the deficit narrative, right, only 20% of childless individuals can be characterized by the profile that are isolated, that are, not engaging with their family. A large majority, about 1/3 of childless Singaporeans actually have diverse network where they exchanges a lot of support, they feel close to their family members. Another 1/3 are actually, even though when they don't have their parents, they're still embedded very much in their extended networks, right? The key point here is only 20% is considered as having restricted networks. So very, very small. So now we turn how that a network profile associated with the life subjective well-being. So our multivariate analysis shows that when we compare people within the childless group, we find, of course, people who have restricted networks tend to do worse, right? They are more likely to report lower life satisfaction. They're more likely to feel depressed and lonely, right? Those who have diverse networks tend to do better. But what is interesting is that when we compare the childless with people who are parents and have similar characteristics, we find that it's only the restricted childless individual with restricted networks that fare worse, right? The remaining 80% of childless are actually doing fine, right? Some are actually doing better than parents. So it's not so much about the presence of children, but rather, their network characteristics. So moving to the third insight, I argue that our data shows that gender moderates this risk and resilience under the condition of limited kin. So let me show you some evidence from Thailand. Now going back to the analysis that looking at the likelihood of receiving care when you have care needs, right? But looking at the difference between men and women. So what we find is that gender differences become especially pronounced once care needs arise. So older Thai men appear particularly vulnerable under the conditions of limited kin. For men, both de facto and actual childlessness are associated with lower odds of receiving care. right? So their access to care appears closely tied to the presence of proximate children. So the presence of spouse does not fully compensate for the absence of nearby children. So you can see that partnered de facto childless men appear to be especially vulnerable. And one possible interpretation is that the presence of a spouse may delay the activation of broader support network and creating a kind of hidden vulnerabilities. Receiving care. Yeah. So in the analysis, in the data, they asked, if you have care needs, do you receive care and who cares for you? But of course, it's very crude. We don't have information about how many hours of care do you receive and what kind of care, specific care that you need. But it's a self-reported. Can I move on? Okay. But by contrast, you see that women in the same with the same kin configurations, like de facto childless or actual childlessness, we didn't see the same kind of penalties happens among women under the same kin constraint. So this pattern is consistent with a broader literature that show that women, characterizes women as kin keepers. So across the life course, they tend to maintain strong ties with siblings, extended kin, and non-kin, right? So this helps explain why kin limitation interacts with gendered life course patterns and resulting in care vulnerabilities that is stratified by gender. So now we turn to another evidence from Singapore where we look at gender differences, not so much in the care receipt, but rather planning for care at the end of life, right? So advanced care planning, just in case you're not familiar with the term, so refers to the process that individual can express their preferences for their end of life care, particularly in the situation where they may lose their capacity to making decision, right? So this can include informal discussions with your loved ones about the type of care that you want to receive, or it can involve formal arrangements such as making living wills or having lasting power of attorney. So in a recent paper, so we look at how childlessness is associated with advanced care planning practices among adults aged 50 and above in Singapore. So we look at we differentiate between different type of ACP, including no planning at all, informal planning only, or formal ACP only without discussions, or the best would be two-prong ACP where you both talk about it and doing it. Right? So these figures show predicted probabilities from multinomial logistic regressions. And the key finding is that childless women are the most engaged in planning. They're the least likely to have no planning. They're most likely to engage in two-prong ACP, right? And these patterns are persistent even after accounting for partnership status, socioeconomic factors, health, and social relationships. Right? So one interpretation is that childless women recognize that the uncertainty that are associated with aging with limited family, and they proactively compensate through care planning. Right? By contrast, childless men are more likely to have no planning at all compared to childless women. Right? So these findings suggest that the same, kind of gender life course processes that we observe in Thailand that are shaping care receipt also shape care planning in Singapore. In both contexts, limited kin does not automatically produce inequality, right? But gender stratify who anticipates, who adapts, and who reorganize under care constraint, kin constraint. So far we have seen three things, right? I'm talking about limited kin as a multi-dimensional process. It's associated with both vulnerabilities and resilience. and that these risks and resilience are stratified, particularly by gender. Right? So the fourth and final takeaway, I want to shift from individual level patterns to broader institutional context. So at the macro level, I argue that inequality does not arise simply because people have fewer kin, but it arises because demographic change, the very compressed population aging in Asia is moving faster than our cultural scripts and our policy framework. In both Singapore and Thailand, norms and institutions have been built around family-based model of aging. So one that assumes that you have a stable marriage, that you have proximate children, that you have reliable intergenerational support exchanges. But this demographic reality is increasingly different, right? So when institution lags behind demographic shift, so limited kins could become consequential. So in our qualitative interview in Singapore, we asked childless individuals how they plan for care at the end of life. And Nancy, who's 77 and kinless, for example, told us that she would enter a nursing home, right? If she become ill because she doesn't want her to burden her sister, right? So she tried to avoid burdening them. So what is striking is that she did not expect care from them, but she still treated family as the most appropriate and the most legitimate source of care, right? And that she mentioned her sister even before she talked about going to nursing home. So similarly, Peach, who's married but estranged from her husband and childless, she struggled to appoint a proxy for her lasting power of attorney. So she talked about, having two brothers, but since the brothers were older than her, so it's not a very reasonable choice. For her, even when family options were not viable, family remained the starting point of the conversation. And once these options were exhausted, she kind of left uncertain about how to proceed. So these two examples suggest that shrinking kin networks do not weaken the cultural pull of familism. Right? Instead, the persistence of familism among childless respondents may narrow their perceived options for care, delay their planning, and generates uncertainty about the future. So in other words, vulnerability arises not from having fewer kin, but actually from having no kin in a system that still assumes that you have family. So just give you a quick example. This is coming back to Thailand, where we ask people who have received care, who cares for them, right? So among those who are de facto childless and actual childless, you would think that the care networks would move outward beyond family, right? But as you can see here, majority of them, if they have spouse, they would depend on their spouse. If not, they would depend on their other relatives, their siblings, their nieces and nephews, and so on and so forth, right? Predicted probabilities of those who reported that main caregivers as non-kin is very, very low, right? Less than 10%. Yeah, so in this sense, limited kin does not automatically lead to diversification of care. It rather produces constraint, right? And limit people to imagine or reimagine beyond their family. So the final layers of and fourth takeaways concerns how demographic change interacts with institutions and moral expectation. And this is beyond Singapore and Thailand. So in much of Asia, family-based model of aging and care remains dominant, as I mentioned earlier. At the same time, many governments have responded to rapid population aging and low fertility with prenatalist discourse. Right? Singapore often seen as an example that government spends so much on pronatalist policies for years, but it hasn't been working, right? So in these contexts, as you can also see in the US as well, right? Having children is often framed as a social obligation, a civic duty, right? So when these two forces are together, familism and pronatalism, they can reinforce each other, and in doing so, it could produce inequality, right? So institutional familism structures how care is organized, whereas pronatalism shapes how parenthood is morally evaluated. So to show how this is not just Singapore and Thailand, so we turn to cross-national evidence. So in a paper, a working paper, my colleagues and I analyzed data from the latest wave of world value surveys. So this figure shows estimate from our multi-level, multinomial logistic regressions not multinomial. So multi-level regressions, right? Where we predict life satisfaction. So the bars represents the difference in life satisfaction between childless adults and parents, right? Across country that have low, medium, and high levels of pronatalist norm. So by pronatalist norm, it refers to a percentage of adults in that country that strongly agree with the statement that having children is duty to society, right? So in society with high pronatalist norm, parenthood may be considered as an expected life course. So childlessness can be seen as incomplete or deviant, right? So in such context, childless individuals may internalize these expectations, which can shape how they interpret their own lives and their future. So as a result, these advantages associated with childlessness are not only material, right? It's not necessarily just access to care support, but it can also arise from stigma, from social pressure, and from how individuals come to see themselves. So the bottom line is that it's not that pronatalist discourses that we see are designed to disadvantage childless individuals. But when aging systems assume family-based care, and when society frame childbearing as social obligations, so those aging with limited kin or particularly childless people, they may experience subtle stigma, reduced recognition, and lower well-being. So let me close by giving you a simple framework that brings these four insights together. So I'm trying to argue that aging under the conditions of limited kin is not just a single condition, it's a process, right? It begins with kin structure, but not just whether or not we have children, but whether children are available or kin are available, and whether or not individuals are embedded in supportive network. And so this produces what I refer to as functional kin constraints, right? So the gap between having kin on paper and having kin who are actually available in practice. From that, people may respond, they may reorganize their support through networks, planning, or other strategies. But this adaptation is uneven. As I show that it's stratified by gender. I didn't have time to look at access to resources, which is another important determinant. And these processes do not unfold in isolation. So they are shaped by broader institutional and normative contexts, right? Systems that continue to assume family care, norms that define what is legitimate and expected life course that can shape how people respond. So when these systems lag behind demographic change, they do not simply fail to support, but they shape how constraints translate into outcomes, and results can be variations in care, well-being, and inequality. So evidence from my research shows that there are at least maybe a couple of pathways that this could take place. One could be that family remains a socially legitimate source of care, even when it's not practically available. Secondly, people might anchor family as a default, which could narrow their perceived options and delays alternative planning. And third, formal systems are not yet fully equipped or they are not culturally normalized to substitute for absent kin, and this can leave individuals uncertain about how to proceed. So the key point is that limited kin does not determine outcomes on its own, but outcomes emerge from interaction between kin availability, between adaptive capacity and institutional context, right? And so in that sense, we are observing not just the decline of family and shrinking kin networks, but we could see that there's a growing mismatch between demographic realities and the system that was built around it. So let me conclude by giving you a few concluding thoughts, and I'm keen to hear your feedback. So I've been thinking about how this work speaks to broader demographic debates, particularly the growing concern around population decline, which is often framed as a crisis, right? Economic stagnation, who's going to take care of older people, right? So what my works try to do is to try to shift the lens to family and kinship dynamics. So I've shown that kin limitation is not inherently a deficit, right? But it can become one when social and institutional arrangements fail to adapt. So when we continue to rely on family-based model, we assume that the availability of kin, or what we see now that, we see a lot of pronatalist responses, right? So I try to argue that instead of looking at demographic change as a story of loss, it may be more productive to think about it as an ongoing transformation of kinship and family. So this perspective, I think, would open to new questions, like what does it mean to do kinship in later life? How might more flexible and chosen form of family or kinship emerge? How can we rethink care in ways that remain culturally meaningful while adapting to new demographic realities? And these are complex challenges, but they also invite us to think more creatively about future of population aging, family and care and kinship. So I hope that my work is a small step towards that direction. So thank you so much. Jessica.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciate it. I especially appreciate your perspective that vulnerability isn't from them having no kin, being the system where that is a problem. I was wondering if you see, given your findings around sort of de facto child being a problem, I was wondering if there are also cultural stigma around children leaving, and if that is also playing into this at all. That if there's any kind of in the way you show the stigma around not having children, if that is also shaping toxic.
Yeah, so I think okay, sure. So I have to remind the audience a question. So your question, if there's any stigma related to being de facto childless, right? I think, given family size is shrinking, and Sarah knows Thailand very well, people in the past, people may have like 5, 6 kids. If 3 migrated to the city, they are still doing okay, right? So right now, people have 2 kids, and Thailand, for example, is, there's the growth is very concentrated. So people move to urban areas for work. I mean, if 1 or 2 child moved, you don't have any children left at home, right? But de facto childless in some way, but when you talk to parents with migrant children, they're actually proud of their children moving away, being able to send money homes and support family. But it become, it become, what should I say? Like, it's become uncertain when care needs arise, right? So a lot of time it's not that easy to like, okay, bring your children back home because they might not be opportunities back at home. And in some ways, when you don't when you have children, but they're not around, that's what I'm trying to argue, that it could be because they fail to reactivate that, right? They think that because of filial piety, that might be enough to pull their children back, right? But there are so many factors when it comes to thinking about, sort of like who would support older persons, right? When care needs arise. Not sure if I answer your questions, but okay, you first and then, yeah.
So my assumption is that your subjects were primarily sexual, so just men models. Do you think that your results would change if you were looking at queer models? Because they would I would assume in Southeast Asia would be students from their areas and then maybe won't have children. And so do you think that they would still rely on filial ties outside of their immediate family? For years. So that's one. And then a related question would be, do you think that the governments of countries like Thailand and Japan are able to scapegoat the responsibility for older age care by emphasizing on filial care?
Okay, great question. So I'm going to try to repeat that. So the first question is about LGBTQ population, right? So the current cohorts that we study, they're still quite rare, but I think they are important case study to look at, right? Because they're probably among the forefront in terms of having to reimagine what kinship is like. Right. So unfortunately, I don't have that data in my study. It's interesting in my Singapore studies. So we interview 1,500 people. For gender, we put in like you can be male, female, or alternative, right? The third options. Out of 1,500, only 2 answer given as the third option. So they don't want to express. But in our interviews, when we go and ask, go back to 30 people, we discovered that a number of them are actually, either gay or lesbians. The second question is on, sorry, repeat that. Right, yes. They don't want to, they often say like, doing the models of Western countries, which I think is misunderstanding, right? That family didn't play a role in Western societies, right? That they think like, oh, institutional care is too expensive, right? So the government, and I think they do think and, genuinely think that culturally, Asian societies built on family, right? So that is very important, right? And in some way, that's all pushing burden of care, responsibilities of care to children too. But attitudes has changed. But it's kind of interesting. In a survey by the World Bank, it shows like people in Thailand wants the government to care for them. But on the ground, they still express children as a desirable source, right? If they have. Yeah, Celine.
Thank you so much for the insightful participation. So you mentioned that one of the really important that they learn about, like the actual childlessness, but it's more about kingdom availability, institutional context, and adaptability. So my question is about adaptability. So what would be some I don't know whether you have observation from interviews or probably outscope. So in terms of adaptability, what are the characteristics of people who have like higher adaptability? Your findings, particularly women, how women have awareness and planning. So other than just like a woman to men differences with other characteristics, for example, the trans women don't plan versus those plan, and how about like the trans men who do have some sort of plan versus those don't?
So your question is what characterizes the likelihood for planning? Okay, yeah, again, resources is very important. And, people of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to plan and plan better. and they often have more alternatives, right? In our interviews, we often find like, okay, either I would move to, retirement communities in Thailand or Malaysia because it's more affordable, right? Or even some people said, I'm going to move to Japan. I was like, really? So, I mean, so there's that factor. People talk about, yesterday we talked about co-housing. So we have seen that too. Like, people build communities together to age and grow together with friends, right? But interestingly, it's more women than men. I haven't come across women yet, or men yet. But I was thinking, I mean, this is something that I want to investigate, but I don't have this information in my data, which is, like this emerging forms of chosen family or collective aging, right? So you have example in China, example in the US and Texas, right? Yeah, so I mean, something that I would like to pursue and, when I return to Asia to collect more data. Did I answer your questions?
Sort of follows. I was having a similar thought about families we choose, which is a conceptual area that we've had here in the US for some time.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you were to rethink that idea, if that was even in the conceptual domain of people in Singapore and Thailand. We had a lady who came and gave a talk on family a few months ago, last year.
Last year, right?
and there was sort of an inkling of that kind of dynamic happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, we worked together on this, workshop that you were part of as well, about how we reinstitutionalize family or reimagine family. So I think, yes, I'm not sure yet, but how it's going to turn out. But I think, but it's kind of interesting. I have another slide that I thought it's kind of interesting. You might have seen this movie, Rental Family. And I think the lure of family is so huge in Asia. And Sarah, you might be interested in this. So you can rent a child in Thailand, right, to help you with doing stuff, right? So the business model that follow like this ideas of familism, it's attractive to people, right? So I want to explore more, and I don't have a lot of information about this yet, but yeah. But if you have any thoughts, examples, please let me know. But adoption is one thing, adoption, this is from actually 19th century Japan, right? That you can adopt a grown-up person to be your children, right? Yeah, I think people actually, I want to, I mean, by the way, this is my potential book project. So, so I'm thinking about historical evidence that, and how people in the past also deal with, but they're under different, it's because mortality, right? Or infertility, because not because they, a little bit of postponement, but it could be also infertility, right? People have different mechanism of adapting. Oh, yeah.
I'm meeting a lot of people, friends that who facing aging issues, move to China or move to Thailand, where they can be cheaper care.
Yeah, so Bill's question is about socioeconomic differences, right? So I think that shapes aging experience a lot, right? Partly because pathway to childlessness also shaped by socioeconomic resources that you have earlier in life. And it turns out to be quite gendered because women tend to follow this pathway of high education, professional career, having children or getting married and having children is opportunity cost for them. So you tend to have increasingly in recent cohorts, people who are childless because, of their high socioeconomic status, and they tend to be women, whereas men is the opposite, right? You require resources to get married. If you don't have those resources, you're likely to not getting married and not having children. So it's sort of a diverging path and outcomes when it comes to how childlessness is associated with aging experiences.
Hi.
Okay.
So, April speaker again.
Thank you so much. And I would love to have more conversations. So please